Imagine this for a moment. You're standing in a crowded market. The air is thick with noise, people bargaining, children laughing, footsteps echoing on the ground. Suddenly, two strangers collide. One, quick to anger, raises his voice. "Watch where you're going." The other feels the heat rise in his chest, ready to fire back. Tension fills the space. The crowd turns to see, and then something unexpected happens. Instead of shouting, the second man simply bows his head slightly and says, "I'm sorry, I must not have been paying attention." The anger dissolves. The heat vanishes as quickly as it arose. The crowd relaxes. The conflict that could have turned into a fight ends right there with nothing more than a gentle word. This is the ripple of a word. One small sound released into the air, shaping emotions, changing outcomes, redirecting the flow of human hearts. We live in a world that often underestimates the power of language. People say, they're just words, but Buddhism teaches us something radically different. Words are not just words, they are karma in motion. They are seeds we plant in the minds of others and in ourselves. They carry the power to wound and the power to heal, the power to ignite wars and the power to dissolve hatreds. Think about it. Empires have risen and fallen because of words. Revolutions have begun with words. Families have broken apart and lovers have reconciled, all through the simple instrument of speech. In Buddhist philosophy, speech is not a casual act. It is one of the pillars of the Noble Eightfold Path, right speech. Why? Because every time you open your mouth, you are shaping reality. You are creating ripples that can echo far beyond your intention. A single insult can linger in someone's heart for decades. A single blessing can inspire them for a lifetime. A gentle word spoken at the right moment has the power to dissolve 1,000 hatreds. But let's be honest, how often do we actually think about this? Most of the time, words fly out of us unexamined. We react without pause, especially when anger takes over. Someone throws a stone, we throw back too. Someone yells, we yell louder. It feels natural, even justified. Yet what really happens? The cycle of hatred deepens and no one truly wins. Buddha understood this cycle better than anyone. He saw how hatred feeds on itself, how anger multiplies like fire when met with more fire. And so he offered an antidote, not silence born of fear, not retaliation born of pride, but the courage of gentleness, the wisdom of compassion expressed through speech. Now pause and reflect. Can you remember a time when someone spoke to you harshly and you answered softly instead? Do you recall how quickly the atmosphere shifted? That is no accident. That is the Dharma in action. Gentleness does not mean weakness. A gentle word is not the absence of power. It is the presence of mastery. It is the strength to respond with clarity instead of impulse, with compassion instead of hostility. It is the ability to disarm anger not by force but by transforming the energy that fuels it. Picture throwing a pebble into a still pond. Ripples spread outward, touching every corner. Words are like that. They ripple through conversations, through relationships, through society itself. Sometimes they ripple through generations. A cruel word can echo down a family line, creating trauma and bitterness. But a gentle word, a word of love, forgiveness, kindness, can ripple in the opposite direction, healing not just one heart but many. This is why the Buddha said, "Speak only the speech that does not torment, that is good for others." Gentle speech is like honey. And it's not just Buddhism that recognizes this. Science, too, is beginning to uncover the psychological and even physiological effects of words. Gentle speech reduces stress hormones, softens the nervous system, and fosters trust between people. Our brains are literally wired to respond to kindness in sound. But let's keep this simple. If anger is fire, then gentle words are water. If hatred is poison, then gentle words are medicine. And if the world often feels like it is drowning in noise, conflict, and hostility, then perhaps what we need most is not louder voices but gentler ones. The question is, can we learn to speak this way not just once in a while but as a way of life? Can we make gentleness the foundation of our conversations, the natural language of our hearts? Because the truth is this, every day you and I are given opportunities opportunities to wound or to heal, to inflame or to calm, to plant seeds of suffering or seeds of peace. Most of the time, we don't even notice how much power rests in the tip of our tongue. But once we realize it, once we see the ripple of a word, we can no longer speak carelessly. This journey we are about to take is not only about understanding words, it is about understanding the mind that speaks them, the heart that shapes them, and the world they create. We are going to look deeply at how hatred arises, how it grows, and how it can dissolve. We will walk alongside the Buddha, listening to the way he transformed enemies into followers with nothing more than words dipped in compassion. We will explore how science and psychology confirm these truths today. And most importantly, we will learn how each of us can begin to practice gentle speech in our own lives, starting from this very moment. So here is the invitation. Listen not only with your ears, but with your heart. Let the stories, the wisdom, and the teachings you are about to hear ripple into your life. And when the moment comes, when anger confronts you, when hatred challenges you, may you remember that a gentle word is more powerful than 1,000 shouts of rage. Because when we master our words, we don't just dissolve hatreds, we create peace. Peace within ourselves, peace with others, peace that can ripple outward, touching lives we may never even know. And this is where our journey begins. Think of the last time someone said something that pierced you. Maybe it was years ago, a parent who told you you'll never amount to anything, or a friend who betrayed you with words meant to wound. Even now, those words might echo in your memory, sharper than any physical scar. Now think of the opposite. A moment when someone spoke words of encouragement, maybe when you doubted yourself the most. A teacher who said, "I believe in you," or a loved one whispering, "You're not alone." Those words became anchors guiding you through storms, shaping the person you've become. This is the invisible power of speech. It slips into the air, unseen, intangible, yet its impact is undeniable. Words can cross oceans, cross generations, live inside the hearts of people long after the sound has faded. Buddhism tells us that speech is not a neutral act. Every word carries intention, and every intention plants a seed. Some seeds blossom into joy and connection. Others grow into weeds of bitterness and division. That is why the Buddha placed right speech at the heart of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right speech means more than avoiding lies or insults. It means choosing words that heal rather than harm, words that unite rather than divide. It means being mindful that language is not just communication, it is creation. To understand this more deeply, imagine speech as a kind of magic, not the fantasy of wizards and spells, but a real human magic. With a single phrase, you can lift someone from despair to hope. With a careless insult, you can shatter their confidence for years. Your tongue is like a brush painting the canvas of another person's soul. Every word leaves a mark. The question is, what kind of mark are you leaving? There is a story from the Buddha's time that illustrates this perfectly. A group of monks once asked him, "What kind of speech should we avoid?" The Buddha replied, "Avoid speech that is harsh, divisive, or idle chatter. Speak words that are truthful, gentle, beneficial, and spoken at the right time." Notice those four qualities: truthful, gentle, beneficial, timely. Together they form the measure of speech that is in harmony with the Dharma. Not just truth, but truth spoken with kindness. Not just kindness, but kindness offered when it matters most. Modern psychology echoes this ancient wisdom. Studies show that when we hear harsh words, our brains release stress hormones. Our bodies literally tighten, preparing for conflict. But when we hear words of kindness, our brains release oxytocin, the same hormone that bonds mothers to infants. In other words, gentle speech literally rewires our biology toward connection instead of division. Isn't that extraordinary? Science confirms what the Buddha knew more than 500 years ago. Words shape not only the mind, but the body itself. And here's something even more subtle. Words don't just affect the listener, they affect the speaker. Every time you speak with anger, that anger grows stronger inside you. Every time you speak with compassion, that compassion deepens. In this way, your words are not just messages to others, they are reflections of who you are becoming. This is why Buddhism treats speech as karma. Karma is not only about what you do with your hands or where you go with your feet. It's about what you create with your voice. Every word you speak sets something in motion, rippling outward in ways you may never see. Think of a stone thrown into a river. The ripples travel far beyond the point of impact. In the same way, a kind word spoken to a child might ripple into their adulthood, shaping how they treat others, shaping how they raise their own children. A cruel word might do the same in the opposite direction. And if we widen the lens, we see this ripple effect not just in personal lives, but in history itself. Wars have begun because of words. Peace treaties have been signed because of words. Entire civilizations have been shaped by the stories people chose to tell, the truths they chose to spread, the lies they allowed to live. This is why the Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." But here lies the challenge. We live in a world overflowing with words. Social media, news cycles, arguments on every corner. We are surrounded by voices, yet so few of them carry wisdom. In this flood of speech, gentle words can feel drowned out, forgotten. But that only makes them more precious, more necessary. So here is the reflection. If words are this powerful, how careful should we be in choosing them? How mindful should we become before opening our mouths, before pressing send, before allowing a thought to transform into sound? Every time we speak, we have a choice. To add to the noise or to bring clarity, to deepen division or to build bridges, to plant seeds of hatred or to plant seeds of peace. And it begins not with grand speeches, not with public declarations, but with the smallest exchanges. The way we greet a stranger, the tone we use with our children, the patience we bring into an argument. Because the invisible power of speech is not just in the dramatic moments of history. It is in the ordinary words we speak every day, words that slowly weave the fabric of our lives. When we begin to see speech this way, not as casual, but as sacred, we begin to transform. We begin to notice the ripple of every word. And when we do, we realize that every conversation is an opportunity to practice compassion, to embody wisdom, to dissolve hatred before it ever takes root. And so, the next step in this journey is to look at hatred itself, to understand how it grows, how it feeds on words, and how a single gentle phrase can interrupt its cycle. Because to master speech, we must also master the fire it can fuel. Hatred is rarely born in an instant. It usually begins as something small, a careless word, a wounded pride, a misunderstanding that lingers unhealed. At first it feels like a spark, harmless, contained, but the truth is hatred has the nature of fire. Left unchecked, it spreads. Feed it with more anger and soon it becomes a blaze that consumes everything in its path. We have all felt this cycle. Someone criticizes us, and immediately we feel the urge to strike back. We raise our voices, sharpen our words, determined to defend ourselves. The other person, feeling attacked, reacts the same way. What began as a spark becomes a flame. And if no one steps back, if no one breaks the chain, it can turn into a wildfire that scorches relationships, families, even entire communities. Buddhism teaches that this is the very nature of hatred. It multiplies when fed. Anger fuels more anger, hostility breeds more hostility. The Buddha put it simply, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal law. It sounds simple, doesn't it? And yet how often do we actually live this truth? Most of the time we believe the opposite, that if we hit back harder, shout louder, we will win. But what do we really win? A brief satisfaction perhaps, but in its place we plant deeper resentment, a wound that festers, a cycle that continues. There is an ancient story from the Buddhist texts. Once a man approached the Buddha furious. He hurled insults at him, calling him a fraud, a deceiver, a man unworthy of respect. Everyone around held their breath, waiting for the Buddha's reply. Would he defend himself? Would he rebuke the man? But the Buddha simply asked, if someone offers you a gift and you refuse to accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The man, startled, answered, "It remains with the one who offered it." Exactly, the Buddha said. So too with your anger, I do not accept it and therefore it remains with you. In that moment the man was silenced, not by force, not by humiliation, but by wisdom. The Buddha refused to feed the cycle of hatred. He let the fire burn out by offering it no fuel. This story is more than history, it is a mirror. How often do we accept the gift of anger, carrying it home with us, holding onto it for days, weeks, even years? And how different would our lives be if we learned, like the Buddha, to simply let it go? Hatred has another dangerous quality. It blinds. When anger controls us, we no longer see clearly. We exaggerate faults, forget virtues, and lose all sense of proportion. A single mistake becomes a reason to condemn someone entirely. One argument overshadows years of love or friendship. In this blindness, we say things we later regret, actions that cannot be undone. And yet, here lies the paradox. When we are under hatred's spell, we feel powerful. Our voice grows louder, our chest swells, adrenaline surges, we think we are strong. But in truth, we are enslaved puppets of our own emotions. True strength is not found in unleashing anger. True strength is found in mastering it. Think of two mirrors facing each other. One reflects anger, the other responds with anger, and the reflection bounces endlessly back and forth, creating an infinite loop. That is the cycle of hatred. It can go on for generations. Families feud, communities divide, nations go to war, all because no one chooses to break the chain. But imagine if one mirror chose not to reflect back. Imagine if one person, instead of responding with anger, responded with gentleness. The reflection ends, the cycle is broken, the fire begins to die. This is not theory, it is the path the Buddha himself walked. Time after time he was confronted by critics, skeptics, even enemies who sought to harm him. And each time, he met hatred with understanding, anger with calm, hostility with compassion. Not because he was weak, but because he understood the law of cause and effect. He knew that hatred, once returned, only deepens suffering. But gentleness has the power to dissolve it. And here is the beauty. This power is not reserved for Buddhas or saints. It is within us right now. Every one of us holds the ability to break the cycle of hatred in our own lives. It begins in the smallest moments, choosing not to argue when provoked, softening our tone when criticized, speaking gently when anger demands harshness. These choices, though small, create ripples. They turn conflict into connection, tension into understanding. But let's be clear, it is not easy. To respond with gentleness when you are burning inside requires courage. It requires mindfulness, the ability to pause, to breathe, to remember the bigger picture. Yet every time we do, we strengthen that muscle. Every time we choose compassion over retaliation, we weaken hatred's hold on us. So the question becomes, what do we want to multiply in this world? Hatred or peace? Anger or compassion? Every word we speak, every reaction we choose is casting a vote. We cannot control the anger of others, but we can control whether or not we feed it. And when we stop feeding it, something extraordinary happens. The cycle breaks. The fire dies down. And in its place, something new can grow, understanding, trust, even love. This is the lesson the Buddha offered, and it is the lesson life keeps offering us, moment after moment. Hatred may be powerful, but it is not unstoppable. Its cycle can be dissolved. And the key often is as simple and profound as a single gentle word. As we journey deeper, let us see how this wisdom was lived, not only in stories of doctrine, but in the very encounters the Buddha faced, where his words turned enemies into disciples, hostility into reverence. Because nothing reveals the power of speech more vividly than watching it transform hatred before our eyes. Imagine a man walking alone on a dusty road. He is tired, hungry, and exhausted from the burden of life. Suddenly, a crowd gathers around him, shouting insults, throwing stones, mocking him for reasons he cannot even comprehend. Most of us in that situation would feel fear, anger, the urge to defend ourselves. We would lash out. We would retaliate. But this man is different. He is Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Throughout his life, the Buddha faced anger from every direction. Kings sought to kill him. Critics shouted at him. Ordinary people jeered, accused, and tried to provoke him. And yet, he never responded with rage. He never met hostility with hostility. One famous story tells of Devadatta, a monk who once tried to create a schism in the Sangha and even attempted to kill the Buddha. Devadatta rolled a large boulder down a hill, hoping it would crush the Buddha during his daily walk. But the Buddha, calm and aware, moved aside effortlessly. And when Devadatta was confronted, the Buddha spoke, not with condemnation, not with accusation, but with gentle words of compassion. May you find peace, may you find freedom from suffering. Think about that for a moment. The man tried to end his life, and the Buddha responded with kindness. This was not naivete. It was not weakness. It was mastery. A mastery of speech, a mastery of mind, and a mastery of karma. Another time, the Buddha visited a town where he was insulted by a group of villagers. They spat on him, mocked him, and hurled cruel words. Most people would have left enraged or perhaps sought revenge. The Buddha remained. Calmly, he addressed the crowd. I do not rejoice in your anger. I do not hate your anger. May you be free from anger and fear. In that moment, something remarkable happened. Some villagers softened. Some reflected on their own hearts. Words that could have been met with violence were met with gentle speech, and the cycle of hostility began to dissolve. These encounters are more than inspiring stories. They are profound lessons in the nature of human emotion and the transformative power of words. The Buddha understood a truth that science is only now beginning to measure. Anger, when met with anger, escalates. But anger, when met with calm, begins to fade. It is easy to be kind to friends, to speak gently to those we love. The challenge, the real test, is speaking gently to those who oppose us, who seek to harm us, who seem undeserving of compassion. Yet this is precisely where the power of a gentle word is most visible. It can stop a fight before it begins. It can soften hearts hardened by pride, resentment, and fear. The Buddha's life is full of these moments. Once, a group of bandits cornered him, demanding all his possessions. Instead of showing fear or trying to escape, the Buddha asked a simple question. Do you intend to harm me? The bandits were struck by the calmness, the presence, the unwavering compassion in his gaze. Something shifted. They lowered their weapons and eventually became his followers. Pause for a moment and imagine this scenario in today's world. A hostile coworker, an angry stranger, a person full of resentment. How often do we respond with even a fraction of the patience, the understanding, the gentleness that the Buddha displayed? Rarely, if ever. And yet, these stories show that it is possible. That gentle speech can transform conflict, even in moments where violence or hatred seems inevitable. The key is mindfulness. The Buddha was never reactive. He observed his own emotions, maintained awareness, and chose his words with intention. He understood that speech is a vehicle of karma. A harsh word spoken in anger plants a seed of suffering not only in the other person but in oneself. A gentle word spoken with awareness and compassion plants seeds of peace, understanding, and connection. Even more profound is this insight. The Buddha did not wait for anger to be extinguished before speaking gently. He met hostility in the moment with clarity and presence. That is the heart of skillful speech, responding with wisdom and compassion, not after the fact, but in real time when it matters most. And this is the lesson we can carry into our own lives. We may not face stones thrown down hills or bandits on the road, but we face criticism, misunderstandings, conflicts, and moments of tension every day. In those moments, we have a choice: to respond with anger, to perpetuate the cycle, or to speak gently, to transform hostility into understanding. The Buddha's encounters with anger teach us that words are not powerless. They are instruments of transformation. They can heal wounds, dissolve resentment, and create possibilities for connection where none seemed possible. Every moment of confrontation is an opportunity to practice this skill, to test the strength of our inner calm, and to cultivate the courage to speak gently even when it is hardest. And as we reflect on these stories, we begin to see a pattern a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern life. The same principles that guided the Buddha's speech thousands of years ago are available to us today. A gentle word can prevent a quarrel, repair a relationship, or even alter the course of someone's life. The ripple begins with the courage to remain calm, the presence to observe one's own emotions, and the choice to respond with compassion. Every encounter with anger is an invitation to dissolve conflict, to practice patience, and to awaken the power of speech that lies within each of us. Because the moment we master our words, we begin to master the world around us, not through force, but through gentle, transformative presence. And it is in this mastery that we see the full scope of what a single word can achieve. But understanding the Buddha's encounters is only the beginning. To truly grasp this power, we must look at how it applies in our own daily lives. How gentle speech can heal families, communities, and even ourselves. Every day our lives are filled with countless interactions. Some are fleeting, a smile exchanged with a stranger, a quick thank you at the coffee shop. Others are more intimate, conversations with family, friends, co-workers, even casual acquaintances. And yet, how often do we pause to consider the impact of our words? How often do we realize that a gentle phrase, spoken at just the right moment, can change the trajectory of someone's day, or even their life? Imagine waking up to a tense morning. Your child is sluggish, your partner is irritated, and the clock is ticking. You could shout, blame, criticize, add fuel to the rising tension. Most people do because it feels immediate, instinctive. But imagine another possibility. You take a breath, soften your tone, and say, I know mornings are tough. Let's start slowly together. The effect is profound. The child relaxes. The partner feels seen. The day begins with connection instead of conflict. This is the subtle, often overlooked power of gentle speech. Buddhism teaches that these ordinary moments are sacred. Every interaction is an opportunity to practice right speech. Every conversation is a chance to plant seeds of understanding, compassion, and peace. Think of the workplace. Meetings can become arenas for competition, criticism, or ego clashes. A single harsh comment can ripple through the office, breeding resentment, stress, and disengagement. But a word of encouragement, a thoughtful question, or a gentle acknowledgement of someone's effort can shift the atmosphere entirely. People feel valued, tension eases, collaboration grows. Gentle speech transforms the ordinary into something extraordinary. Even casual encounters hold this power. Imagine waiting in line, frustrated by the slow service. You could grumble, sigh, or snap at the cashier. Or you could smile and say, "Thank you for your help, I appreciate your patience." The line feels lighter. The cashier's day is softened. The ripple spreads beyond that moment because people remember kindness. The true genius of gentle speech is that it is simple yet profound. It does not require eloquence or grand gestures. It requires presence, awareness, and intention. It requires pausing before speaking, listening deeply, and choosing words that heal rather than harm. Let's bring this closer to home. Families are the first training ground for gentle speech. Children absorb not just instructions, but the tone, the energy, the spirit in which words are delivered. A gentle word to a child fosters confidence, security, and emotional intelligence. A gentle word between spouses nurtures trust, love, and patience. Even disagreements, when navigated with care, become opportunities for connection rather than division. And this applies to friendships too. Misunderstandings can arise, hurt feelings can linger, yet a calm, kind, and honest word has the power to restore bonds. One thoughtful phrase, asterisk, I see your point and I value you, asterisk, can dissolve months of tension. In Buddhism, this is not just philosophy, it is practical wisdom. The Buddha recognized that the world is shaped not only by monumental acts but by countless small moments of mindful, compassionate speech. These moments accumulate, creating environments of peace rather than conflict, understanding rather than division. The science of communication aligns perfectly with this wisdom. Research shows that gentle, empathetic speech reduces stress, increases cooperation and fosters positive relationships. When we speak kindly, we release oxytocin in the brain, sometimes called the bonding hormone, enhancing trust and social connection. Words literally change the chemistry of our brains and the lives of those around us. But gentle speech is not always easy. Life is messy. People are impatient, circumstances frustrating. We encounter rudeness, criticism, and even hostility. And yet it is precisely in these moments that the practice matters most. Choosing gentleness when it is hardest, responding with calm rather than defensiveness, with compassion rather than judgment. This is the true power of right speech. Consider a simple exercise. Pause before responding. Ask yourself, will my words bring peace or further conflict? Will they heal or harm? This moment of reflection, even just a second, can make all the difference. Over time, these choices become a habit, a natural way of being, and the ripple effects extend far beyond what we can see. Gentle speech is also about tone, not just content. A kind phrase delivered harshly can cut like a knife. Conversely, even a simple acknowledgement, if spoken softly and sincerely, can heal wounds. This is why mindfulness is crucial, not just thinking before we speak, but feeling before we speak, attuning to the impact our voice has on the hearts of others. And here is the most remarkable part. Practicing gentle speech transforms us as much as it transforms those around us. Our own hearts soften, our minds calm, and our awareness deepens. We become more patient, more compassionate, more present. The ripple starts within ourselves before it extends outward. Every smile, every soft word, every patient explanation is a thread in the fabric of peace. In families, in workplaces, in communities, these threads weave together to form a tapestry of understanding, resilience, and connection. Gentle speech is not just polite, it is revolutionary. It is the quiet force that prevents arguments from escalating, that stops resentment from festering, that dissolves hostility before it can take root. And so, as we walk through life, we carry the lessons of the Buddha's encounters with anger into our daily interactions. We realize that every conversation, whether with a stranger, a friend, or a loved one, is an opportunity to plant seeds of peace. We begin to see the world not as a battlefield, but as a classroom where every moment is a chance to practice kindness, to speak with intention, and to transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. By choosing gentle speech, we are not merely avoiding conflict. We are actively creating harmony, fostering connection, and building a foundation of trust and understanding. And in this way, the ripples of our words extend far beyond the moment, touching lives we may never even know, spreading peace one conversation at a time. The next step in this journey is to see how this wisdom aligns with modern science, the ways in which words, tone, and intention shape our brains, our relationships, and our societies. Because when ancient insight meets contemporary research, we begin to understand the full power of what a single word, spoken with care, can accomplish. It's fascinating, isn't it, how the wisdom of the Buddha, spoken more than 2,000 years ago, aligns so closely with modern science. What the Buddha observed in the human mind through meditation and insight, scientists today are beginning to confirm in laboratories, brain scans, and psychological studies. Words, it seems, are not just sound. They are energy, chemistry, and influence combined. Consider this. When someone speaks to us with harshness or anger, we feel it immediately. Our chest tightens, our heart races, a subtle tension grips our muscles. We react, often without thinking. Science tells us that this is not just imagination. Hearing angry words triggers the release of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, priming us for fight or flight. Our brains perceive verbal attacks much like physical threats. A cruel word can literally feel like a punch. Now think of gentle, compassionate speech, the kind that acknowledges, comforts, and supports. Studies show that hearing these words triggers the release of oxytocin, sometimes called the love hormone or bonding hormone. This chemical creates a sense of trust, calm, and connection. Our heart rate slows, muscles relax. The nervous system shifts from survival mode to openness and receptivity. In other words, the brain responds to kindness in sound. The very chemistry of our bodies is altered by words. This is remarkable because it bridges what was once considered spiritual intuition with empirical science. The Buddha understood that words carry karmic weight. Modern psychology and neuroscience are beginning to map exactly how that weight manifests physically and emotionally. Gentle speech does not just soothe the mind. It shapes it, rewires it, creates patterns of peace where chaos once thrived. But it doesn't stop there. Words influence not only the listener but the speaker as well. Every time we speak harshly, our brain reinforces pathways associated with anger, stress, and hostility. Every time we speak gently, pathways associated with empathy, compassion, and emotional regulation strengthen. The act of speaking kindly transforms us internally, aligning mind, body, and heart with harmony. Think about conversations in your own life. A tense argument escalates quickly, words flying in anger. We feel justified, yet stressed, irritable, and often exhausted afterward. Now imagine that same conversation approached with mindfulness. We choose our words carefully, soften our tone, and speak with compassion. The same circumstances, the same disagreement, but the outcome is completely different. Hearts are less wounded, understanding grows, bridges are built. This is the practical application of both ancient wisdom and modern science. The Buddha's teaching of right speech is not abstract, it is embodied. It is a tool to shape reality, not just philosophy to ponder. And science confirms that the mind responds predictably to the quality of our words. There is also something deeply profound here. Intention matters as much as words themselves. A gentle word spoken mechanically, without awareness or care, has far less impact than a simple word spoken with presence, with empathy, and with sincerity. Neuroscience shows that humans are highly sensitive to tone, subtle cues, and emotional resonance. Our brains detect authenticity, and our bodies respond accordingly. Words combined with true compassion create far-reaching effects that words alone cannot achieve. Imagine a workplace where managers speak to employees with understanding and encouragement rather than criticism and sarcasm. Not only do employees perform better, but stress levels drop, collaboration improves, and trust flourishes. The ripple of gentle speech extends through entire organizations, communities, and networks. It is the practical science of kindness in action. Even more astonishing is how these effects extend across generations. Children who grow up in environments of gentle speech develop better emotional regulation, empathy, and resilience. They carry these patterns into adulthood, influencing their relationships, families, and societies. One gentle word today can ripple through decades, shaping lives yet unseen. This is why Buddhism emphasizes mindfulness in speech. It is not merely about avoiding lies or insults. It is about consciously creating an environment of care, understanding, and growth with each word we speak. And modern research affirms that this is not mystical. It is measurable, observable, and reproducible. Now imagine combining both approaches, ancient wisdom and modern science. We begin to see a complete picture. Words are more than communication. They are instruments of transformation. They influence emotions, physiology, relationships, and even society at large. A gentle word is not passive. It is active, powerful, and profoundly transformative. And here lies the invitation. The next time you speak, pause. Consider not just what you are saying, but the ripple it may create in another person's heart and mind. Consider the science, the psychology, and the wisdom of ages. Choose words that heal, words that calm, words that plant seeds of understanding. Because each word is a tool to shape reality, to dissolve hatred, and to cultivate peace. As we continue this journey, we will explore the courage required to practice gentle speech consistently. It is one thing to speak kindly when it is easy. It is another to do so in the face of provocation, misunderstanding, or hostility. And yet, it is in these moments, the hardest of all, that the true power of speech is revealed. Gentleness is not weakness. This is a truth that seems simple, yet the world often misunderstands it. To speak softly, to respond with patience, to choose kindness over retaliation, many mistake this for passivity. But in reality, gentleness requires immense courage. It is strength under control. It is the mastery of self in the face of provocation, fear, and anger. Imagine a heated argument. Voices rise, emotions flare, the mind races with justification and defense. To respond with a gentle word in such a moment is not easy. It takes awareness, it takes discipline, and most of all, it takes courage. It is a conscious choice to step away from the instinct to fight, to reject the urge to escalate, and instead to plant seeds of calm. The Buddha understood this. He did not silence himself to avoid conflict. He did not retreat out of fear. He met anger with calm, hostility with compassion, ridicule with patience. Every gentle word he spoke in the face of provocation was an act of bravery, a refusal to let hatred dictate the moment. There is a story of a woman who approached the Buddha, furious at a perceived injustice. She shouted, she accused, she demanded. Those around were afraid, bracing for the eruption of anger to follow. But the Buddha remained calm. With a gentle tone and compassionate gaze, he said, "Let us speak together with clarity and understanding. I wish to hear your heart." In that instant, the tension began to dissolve. Anger softened, her voice lowered. The conflict, once headed toward chaos, transformed into dialogue. This is the courage of gentleness. It does not avoid reality. It does not pretend problems do not exist. Instead, it faces the storm with equanimity and skill, redirecting energy toward peace. Courage to be gentle also means speaking the truth with kindness. It is easier to stay silent, to let injustice pass, or to avoid discomfort. But gentle speech sometimes demands honesty, delivered with care, in a way that uplifts rather than wounds. The Buddha taught that right speech is truthful, beneficial, and timely. And often the most courageous words are those spoken with the heart fully engaged, aiming not to dominate but to heal. Consider everyday life. A friend makes a mistake that frustrates you. A coworker challenges your ideas aggressively. A family member pushes your buttons. Your instinct may be to react with irritation, sarcasm, or sharpness, but responding gently requires courage. A decision to prioritize understanding over defense, connection over victory, love over ego. Courage to be gentle is also about patience. Hatred, misunderstanding, and anger do not dissolve instantly. Sometimes it takes repeated acts of gentle speech to transform a situation, to melt resistance, to create trust. Each small word of compassion is a brick in the foundation of change, and each brick requires intentionality, mindfulness, and yes, bravery. Why bravery? Because choosing gentleness in a hostile world is counterintuitive. Society often rewards aggression, loudness, and force. Being calm when others are shouting can make you seem weak. Speaking kindly when provoked can expose you to mockery or misunderstanding. Yet the Buddha showed that true power does not lie in domination. It lies in mastery over self and in the ability to influence others without coercion. There is an inner reward too. Every time we choose gentle speech in the face of difficulty, we cultivate equanimity. We strengthen emotional resilience. We train the mind to remain stable, aware, and compassionate even when external circumstances are turbulent. Courage is not only expressed outwardly, it grows inwardly, transforming our own hearts and minds. Think of a flame. A gentle word in a moment of anger is like a candle held against the wind. It may flicker, it may seem fragile, yet it illuminates and dispels darkness. Each act of courage and gentleness strengthens the flame, allowing it to spread light in ways that force, harshness, or volume never could. And this is the essence of Buddhist practice. Courage and gentleness are inseparable. The truly brave are those who choose not to harm, even when provoked. The truly strong are those who respond with clarity, calm, and compassion. And the ripple effect is extraordinary. One gentle word spoken bravely can shift a family dynamic, calm a workplace, mend a friendship, or inspire someone to act with compassion themselves. So the question arises, are we willing to cultivate this courage? Are we willing to pause before responding, to breathe, to choose words that heal? Are we ready to confront the challenge of speaking gently when it is hardest, when the mind urges us to strike back, when our pride demands defense, when our anger wants release? Because this is the true test of mastery, not in moments of ease, but in moments of challenge. Not when it is convenient, but when it is necessary. Not when everyone is watching, but when only our own conscience witnesses the choice. Every act of courageous gentleness is a small revolution against the cycle of hatred. Every conscious word spoken with care is a seed planted for peace. And over time, these seeds grow into gardens of understanding, empathy, and connection, transforming not only our own lives but the world around us. The Buddha's life is our guide. His encounters with anger, his unwavering calm, his gentle words in the face of hostility, all of it demonstrates that courage and gentleness are not opposites, they are allies. One cannot exist fully without the other, and when we cultivate both, we step into a power far greater than aggression or dominance. The power to transform hearts, to dissolve hatred, and to awaken peace. And as we carry this understanding into our own lives, the next step is to explore the lasting impact of gentle speech, not only in moments of conflict, but in shaping relationships, communities, and even generations. How far can the ripple of a single, courageous word reach? That is the journey we will uncover in the next chapter. What if I told you that every word you speak is a reflection of your mind? That the tongue is not just a tool for communication, but a mirror revealing the state of your heart? In Buddhism, speech and mind are inseparable. To master speech is to master the mind. To master the mind is to master the ripple of every word we release into the world. Think about it. How often do we speak without awareness? We complain, we criticize, we gossip, we snap, all reflexively, all unconsciously. Each word carries a weight, a vibration, a subtle energy, and often it is our untrained mind that drives our tongue rather than our wisdom guiding it. Training the tongue is not about silence, it is about mindfulness. It is about noticing the impulse to speak, pausing and asking, is this word necessary? Is it kind? Is it truthful? Will it create harmony or discord? These questions are not restrictions, they are tools to cultivate freedom. Because when the tongue is trained, the mind becomes disciplined and freedom from the cycles of anger, hatred, and misunderstanding begins. The Buddha taught this in the Vinaya, the monastic code. Mindfully restrain your speech. Speak only what is true, beneficial, and timely. This is more than ethical guidance. It is practical training for the mind. Every time we pause before speaking, we practice self-awareness. Every time we choose compassion over impulse, we strengthen mental clarity. Let's break this down further. First, truthfulness. Speaking truth is not merely stating facts. It is speaking in alignment with reality without exaggeration, deceit, or distortion. Truthful speech grounds us, stabilizes relationships, and fosters trust. When our words align with reality, our mind aligns with reality. Second, benevolence. Words should uplift, soothe, or enlighten. This doesn't mean we avoid hard conversations. It means we frame them with care. Even critique can be delivered with gentleness, clarity, and respect. Benevolent speech plants seeds of peace, whereas harsh speech sows resentment and misunderstanding. Third, timeliness. Even the truest and kindest words can fall flat if delivered at the wrong moment. Speaking in anger, impatience, or distraction often backfires. Mindful timing requires sensitivity, awareness of context, and attunement to the other person's state. It is the art of knowing when words will heal, rather than harm. Training the tongue is, in essence, training the mind to pause, reflect, and respond consciously. And here lies the profound insight. A disciplined mind produces disciplined speech. Thoughts no longer run unchecked, words no longer fly uncontrolled. We become creators rather than reactors, shaping our environment and relationships with intention and care. There is an ancient Zen saying, Before you speak, let your words pass through 3 gates. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? This simple practice, repeated over time, transforms the way we think and act. The mind learns patience. The heart learns empathy. Speech becomes a vehicle for harmony rather than discord. Consider daily life. How often do we interrupt, argue impulsively, or speak from frustration? Training the tongue invites a pause to breathe, a pause to notice the rising emotions, a pause to choose words that reflect wisdom rather than reaction. Over time, these pauses cultivate mindfulness, emotional balance, and deep self-awareness. And this is not just spiritual philosophy. It is supported by science. Neuroscience shows that mindfulness practices, including mindful speech, strengthen areas of the brain associated with emotional regulation, empathy, and decision-making. The act of pausing, reflecting, and choosing words consciously literally rewires the mind toward calmness and clarity. The ripple effect is extraordinary. When the mind is trained and the tongue speaks with awareness, relationships improve. Conflicts are prevented or de-escalated. Communities function with less friction. And importantly, our own inner landscape becomes peaceful as the mind no longer fuels cycles of anger, worry, or guilt. Think of training the tongue as tending a garden. Each word is a seed. Harsh or careless words are weeds that grow into resentment and conflict. Gentle, mindful words are seeds of understanding and connection. Tend your speech carefully and the mind flourishes alongside it. Neglect your speech and the mind becomes wild, tangled, and chaotic. This is the profound teaching. Mastery over speech is mastery over life. The ripple of a single word spoken with awareness can transform an argument, heal a wound, or inspire hope. And when practiced consistently, this mastery creates a life guided not by reaction, but by intentional compassion. Training the tongue trains the mind. Training the mind trains the heart. And together, they create a life where words are no longer a source of conflict, but a bridge to understanding, empathy, and peace. We often think of communication in terms of words. We assume that speaking is the only way to express, to resolve, to connect. But there is another power, subtle, profound, and often overlooked, the power of silence. In Buddhism, silence is not emptiness. It is presence. It is a language of the heart that transcends words, dissolves tension, and creates space for healing. Imagine a heated conversation. Voices are raised, emotions are raw, and words seem inadequate or even harmful. A pause, a conscious silence can shift the entire energy. Not avoidance, not fear, but awareness. A moment to breathe, to center, to witness your own mind and the emotions of others. This silence is active. It speaks volumes without a single syllable. The Buddha often taught through silence. In moments of hostility, ridicule, or misunderstanding, he sometimes said nothing at all. And in that stillness, the message was louder than words could ever convey. The intent, the presence, the unwavering calm, all communicated a depth of understanding that the mind of the other person could not ignore. Silence heals because it allows space. Space for reflection, for perspective, for the emotions to settle. Words, especially when driven by anger or fear, can inflame. Silence allows the fire to cool. It is a tool for creating clarity, a pause that allows wisdom to arise. Consider a simple moment in daily life. Someone criticizes you harshly. The immediate impulse might be to respond, defend, or retaliate. But pausing, even for a breath or two, transforms the encounter. In that silence, you regain composure, observe your own reaction, and choose a response that is deliberate rather than reactive. Often, even the absence of words conveys more powerfully than any argument ever could. There is a famous story in Buddhist texts. A monk approached the Buddha, furious and ready to argue. The Buddha said nothing at first. The monk shouted, gestured, and vented. After a moment, the Buddha simply looked at him with calm attention, and in that gaze, the monk's anger began to dissolve. No words were needed. The presence alone communicated understanding, patience, and compassion. Silence is also a space for listening. True communication is not just speaking. It is receiving, understanding, and holding the other person's experience with care. When we listen deeply, without immediately responding or judging, we allow transformation to occur. The other person feels heard, recognized, and respected. This is a form of healing that words alone often cannot achieve. In Buddhist meditation, silence is a foundation. Sitting in stillness, observing thoughts, watching emotions arise and pass, cultivates awareness and clarity. This inner silence trains the mind to respond with wisdom rather than habit, to choose speech carefully, and to recognize when words are necessary and when they are not. The practice of silence is the practice of mastery over self and circumstance. Silence also has a ripple effect. When we do not react impulsively, when we hold a pause, the energy of the room shifts, tension relaxes, hearts soften. Others are given permission to pause, reflect, and respond with awareness. One person's stillness can influence an entire group. Just as gentle words ripple outward, so too does intentional silence create waves of calm. And yet, silence is not emptiness or avoidance. It is not indifference. It is an engaged presence, a mindful attention that communicates more than words can capture. It is the calm in the storm, the eye in the chaos, the quiet force that allows understanding, compassion, and clarity to arise naturally. In a world dominated by noise, constant chatter, endless opinions, and ceaseless messages, the practice of silence becomes revolutionary. It teaches patience, reflection, and the wisdom to discern when to speak and when to let the heart speak without words. It reminds us that transformation does not always require action. Sometimes it requires presence. The greatest teachers, the most profound healers, have often shown that silence is a powerful tool. It is in silence that insight arises, anger dissolves, and understanding deepens. It is in silence that the seeds of peace are planted, sometimes taking root far beyond what words could achieve. And so, as we approach the final chapter, we begin to see the full journey. From a gentle word that dissolves hatred, to mindful speech that transforms relationships, to the courage that sustains compassion, and finally, to silence, the quiet force that heals hearts and minds alike. Words and silence together form the complete language of wisdom, the interplay of action and presence that can change lives. We began this journey with a simple phrase. A gentle word dissolves 1,000 hatreds. At first, it may have sounded poetic, abstract, almost mystical, but as we have explored together, this is no mere saying. It is a principle that can transform lives, relationships, communities, and even the world. The journey from understanding to practice begins with awareness. Every word we speak carries weight. Every pause, every breath, every tone shapes reality in ways we may not immediately see. A harsh word can inflame anger, breed resentment, and perpetuate cycles of suffering. A gentle word spoken with intention can calm hearts, foster trust, and plant seeds of lasting peace. Throughout this journey, we have seen the Buddha's life as our guide. His encounters with anger, hostility, and criticism were not met with retaliation, but with calm, presence, and compassion. His words were deliberate, his silence intentional. In every action, he demonstrated the extraordinary power of speech rooted in mindfulness and courage. We have explored how gentle speech in daily life transforms ordinary moments, interactions with family, friends, co-workers, or even strangers. These moments, though seemingly small, create ripples. The ripple of a kind word can extend far beyond the immediate moment, touching hearts we may never see, creating connections that strengthen the fabric of humanity. Science and psychology confirm what Buddhism has taught for centuries. Words influence the mind, the body, and the nervous system. Harsh speech triggers stress, anxiety, and conflict, while gentle words cultivate trust, empathy, and cooperation. Every act of mindful speech is a deliberate act of transformation, both internally and externally. Yet, the path of gentle speech is not always easy. It requires courage. The courage to speak with kindness in the face of provocation, to remain calm when others are shouting, to choose understanding over pride, compassion over retaliation. This courage is the hallmark of true mastery, the mastery of self and the conscious creation of harmony in the world. We have also discovered the power of silence. Silence is not emptiness, it is presence. It allows us to observe, reflect, and respond with clarity. Silence gives space for emotions to settle, for insight to emerge, and for connection to deepen. Words and silence together form a complete language of wisdom, a balance of action and stillness that can transform lives. Training the tongue, training the mind, this is the daily practice. Every time we pause before speaking, we cultivate awareness. Every time we choose compassion over impulse, we strengthen our ability to navigate life with wisdom. Every act of mindful speech, every moment of conscious silence, creates a ripple that extends outward, far beyond ourselves. The ripple of a gentle word is profound because it is contagious. When we speak with care, others respond in kind. Anger diminishes, understanding grows, and peace spreads. This is how small, deliberate acts of kindness can scale into movements of compassion, healing not only personal relationships but entire communities and, ultimately, societies. Imagine a world where words are chosen with awareness, where speech is used to heal rather than hurt, where silence is embraced as a space of reflection and presence. A world where courage is measured not by dominance, but by the ability to remain calm, compassionate, and mindful even under pressure. This is the world we can create, one word, one pause, one conscious choice at a time. And the beauty of this path is that it begins here with us. You do not need to be a monk, a scholar, or a spiritual master. You only need awareness, intention, and the willingness to act. Every gentle word you speak is a seed of transformation. Every mindful pause is a breath of peace. And over time, these seeds grow into a life and a world where understanding, compassion, and harmony flourish. So let this be our practice, our promise, our invitation, to speak gently, to act with presence, to listen with empathy, and to allow silence to teach us its profound lessons. To remember that the smallest word, when spoken with care, can dissolve 1,000 hatreds. Let us carry this wisdom forward, not only in meditation or reflection, but in every encounter, every conversation, every moment of life. Because the path of peace is not abstract, it is real, tangible, and created moment by moment, word by word. And as we conclude this journey together, remember, the ripple begins with you. The choice is yours. Speak gently, pause mindfully, listen deeply, and watch as the world changes, one word, one silence, one conscious act at a time. A gentle word is not just a tool, it is a path, a practice, a revolution of the heart. And in embracing it, we embrace the possibility of a world rooted in compassion, understanding, and lasting peace. If this journey through the power of gentle speech has touched your heart, take a moment to carry it forward in your own life. Let your words ripple kindness. Let your silence cultivate peace. And if you wish to continue exploring the timeless wisdom of Buddhism and to uncover practices that bring calm, clarity, and compassion into everyday life, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Join our growing community of mindful seekers. Together, we can practice patience, speak with intention, and create a world where understanding and peace flourish, one gentle word at a time.